It is a little rainy. We have beautiful fall weather. I saw on a sign at Chick-fil-A today that said, it said, autumn, uh, what did it say? Autumn, uh, autumn skies, uh, waffle fries. So, or some autumn skies mean waffle fries, I guess, or something like that, or think waffle fries. So, of course, it definitely made me want to go get waffle fries. I am a fan of waffle fries. We are already at our club webinar 36. Now, if you're new, our club webinars are subjects that have come in from club members on the CCO Club. We have more information about that at the end of the webinar that just need a little help with something. It could be a student. It could be somebody that is new to coding. Sometimes it's coders that are out there in the trenches. Maybe somebody wants another opinion on coding clinic or a scenario that they've run across. And sometimes it's people getting ready to test for an exam. We do have education in several certifications with multiple organizations. And so the club is there as a community to help everybody reach out to each other. And I found a really unique question that had come in that sparked some thoughts from the conference that I was just at, the symposium in Houston this past weekend. And we have talked about causal relationships before. You can go in and probably see them in the club recordings. We probably have some videos in YouTube. Just type in relationship or causal and they'll pop up. And a lot of times when we educate on causal relationships with medical coding, we tend to use diabetes as an example. And I know it seems like that we had talked about this somewhat recently, but it was probably in a student webinar. So, because it was a concept we were trying to teach. Well, this question came into the club and I wanted to kind of highlight some other information. So it's medical coding causal relationships. And we're going to give you kind of like a coder's perspective of that. This is the question that actually came in. And she was wanting to know, we have a patient that comes in with chest pain and anemia. They know they have chest pain and anemia, and they get blood transfusions. That's for the anemia. But it's noted that the patient has CKD. So she's asking, do you code? Which anemia do we code? Do we code the D64.9 anemia is not specified, or D63.1 anemia in CKD, which is a causal, is there a causal relationship there? So what are we going to do? And the fact is it can get very confusing. Now, of course, we didn't get to see the whole report. Now that would make a difference if we could see the entire encounter or the documentation in full. So again, bear with me as I render kind of my opinion, my humble opinion. However, I'm going to tell you what to look for. These are the factors that you need to think about when you go into a situation like this, or if you want to do more research. I'm going to show you what I do to research a scenario like this. Now, if you're in the trenches and you're coding ongoing and stuff, you don't have a lot of time actually to really go in and do some of this in-depth investigation. You may have to set that encounter aside depending on what type of coding that you do. But if it is a scenario that you need to set up a protocol for, you can do the research and then get a memo out there to the staff members and say, hey, this is what coding clinic says, or this is the information off the research that I found, and ultimately, especially with diagnosis codes, you're not getting paid or reimbursed via diagnosis codes, your ICD codes in the outpatient world. You are being reimbursed on the diagnosis codes for inpatient. Okay, that is true. So in the outpatient if your diagnosis code is not perfect, oh, let's say not perfect. Let's say you've got a choice. It could go either way, all right? Uh, so, and maybe you've queried the provider, or you haven't been able to query the provider for whatever reason, then know that nobody's going to come down and get you. The coding boogeyman isn't coming to get you. However, we always want to remember we code for statistical purposes, and we are audited, right? We have to use our diagnosis codes to show the disease and the disease process that warrants the treatment that's being done, right? Medical decision making is based partly on what's wrong with the patient, what's the diagnosis. So we have to be mindful of that. Now, if you see that scenario, and our person that asked the questions, if they use the D64.9 or they use the D63.1, our head's going to roll. No, they're not. Okay. But an auditor may come in and say, hey, that's not the code I would use in that scenario. Okay. So again, when you come up with situations like that, educate, talk to the other people in the office and say, when this situation arises, how are we going to handle this? And what are we, based on all of the research and the information that we have at our fingertips. Oh, and a little caveat to that is, just because I said the research and the information at your fingertips, you're still responsible. Okay. On another situation, if you upcode or do something, fraud and abuse is based on mindfully doing something wrong, and you should have known better. Okay, so don't think that just because you don't know it, that doesn't get you out of trouble. But we're really not talking about that. So let's think about this scenario and how it relates to causal relationships, and what is the right answer for the information that we have. Now, her ultimate question is, are we going to use D64.9 anemia unspecified, or are we going to link the CKD and the anemia, which is D63.1? And that is a very different code. Now, it's still a D code and an anemia code, but if you've had to deal with patients with anemia, or you understand the disease process with anemia, it is diverse. Anemia can happen with a lot of different conditions. It can be a side effect. It can also be the cause of other conditions. When we talk about side effects and the rules, the guidelines get a little hairy and unique, especially when we look at documentation for, say, chemotherapy. So there are codes for patients who have anemia due to the chemotherapy they're receiving. And then there's a different set of rules and guidelines for if they have anemia due to the cancer. Two separate things, right? And different guidelines are applicable in those scenarios and sequencing. So in this situation, if we link the causal relationship and the CKD with the anemia, then there is a guideline that tells us code first the CKD, okay, the underlying condition. So that would need to be noted, okay, but we're not talking about that. We're just deciding to which anemia to go with. And it all really boils down when understanding causal relationship, the indent. Okay. Now, you think, oh, is it that simple? Well, yeah, it actually is. So I am going to go to the next slide, but we're going to come back to the indent. Let's talk about anemia and CKD. I did find this on this website, which I have linked here for you, and I've also pulled up the actual article that it came from, because it's got a lot of great information. And this right here, this whole paragraph, 2 paragraphs, actually it was 1 paragraph and I separated it. This comes directly from that. Okay. What we need to understand is the disease process to be able to get to the highest specificity. by all means, first we can query the provider, but let's query the provider being educated. Okay, let's understand what we're asking first, and then ask the provider which scenario, which scenario are we going with here. So how are they related? Well, the fact is anemia is pretty common with CKD patients, and it says that it'll say, okay, we're going to tell you how it's related. The main thing that you want to know is that anemia might begin to develop in the early stages of CKD. But then it goes on to say 20 to 50% of normal kidney function, when somebody has that, and then as the CKD worsens, of course, then they're more likely to become anemic. It is associated. And then we say, okay, why? Because the total loss of kidney function or kidney failure, these people have anemia. And and if a person is on dialysis, that's pertinent as well. Make sure you know whether the person is on hemodialysis or peritoneal dialysis. Now, if you don't know what either one of those are, you need to jot that down in your notebook and go do a little more research. But ultimately, hemodialysis is where they plug you into the machine and they take your blood and they flush it. So you have to sit there at the dialysis center for a significant amount of time, 2-3 times a week. Whereas peritoneal dialysis is where they flush this fluid into the abdomen, and it's something that could be done at home, and you might not have to go to the dialysis clinic, but you do have to be hooked up. Okay, so keep that in mind. Is if your patient is on dialysis, they're more likely to have that that relationship with the anemia. Of course, we didn't have that information for this patient. We aren't told that. Let's talk about the different types of anemia. Now, I was able to pull this from our Find a Code that we're so fond of, and ultimately it was under the basic anemia unspecified. There are different types of anemia. So if the anemia is identified, and then again, that tells you if it's related to the CKD or not. Right. So if we have a congenital type, then of course the CKD, that's different. It's something congenital that was going on. Is it due to the adenoplastic chemotherapy? So if this patient came in and they, had the chest pain, they had the anemia, they were also they had CKD and they were getting chemotherapy. Oh, okay. Well, the anemia may be due to the chemotherapy, and absolutely we need to double check. It's probably not because of the CKD. It could be due to the chemotherapy. So again, just knowing right away, do we have any definition of the type of anemia? And this particular scenario, we don't. It just says anemia. So again, anemia unspecified would be what we would go with if the person didn't have CKD and we didn't have to ask ourselves, hey, is there a relationship there? So make sure that you're familiar with the different types of anemia. You don't have to have these memorized, by all means. Don't think that you have to have these memorized because I don't have them memorized. But when there's more information. Sometimes you don't know what you don't know until you find out what you don't know. Does that make sense? So again, it's important to be aware of something that's as broad as anemia. And CKD, quite honestly, can be quite broad, and we're going to show you here in just a second. So moving on, let's look at that. When we look at anemia and we look at it in the index, okay, this is what we are looking for. We go and we type anemia, and it's going to come up in the index, and it's going to tell us that these are the different types of anemia that are our starting point. Okay, and remember, if they're in the parentheticals, that just means it's included. Okay, so we have primary, profound, essential, general. It'd be the same code. But our code range is going to be, anemia is pulled out of D50 through D89 because it's a blood disease, a blood disorder. Something's going on with the blood. But anemia itself, okay, is going to be a smaller code range, and we're going to go look at D60 through D64. And the codes that she picked, the two, are the ones that I would be looking at, right? There isn't something out there, but that is in the code range that we were looking at. And that was we've got other anemias, D64, and then anemia unspecified falls under that 0.9. Just a heads up, if you're new to coding and looking up codes, whenever you have a code that a diagnosis code that ends in a 9, a lot of time that refers to an unspecified code. So we don't have all the details to be able to say it's this one or that one because the documentation's not there. And that's not always a bad thing because maybe the testing hasn't come back for us to determine a higher specificity. If you're an inpatient, you'll eventually get to that point because testing will be done. But there is a need for, unspecified. And this may be a scenario where that would be the case because, again, the person came into the ER, right? So we're doing testing. We need to find out. That is not 100% though. Sometimes the 9 means other, right? But 95% of the time, if you see a 9 at the end of an ICD code, it's probably unspecified. So when we look at the index and we're going to look at anemias, the next thing that I look for when I look at that index is if there is a CKD, anemia with CKD, right? And how that's lined up in the index is going to be very, very telling. So if you have your ICD manual, feel free to look up anemia as we go along here, or pause the video if you're not live streaming, and go look up anemia. And you'll notice that it'll say anemia, and then it'll indent, and then it'll list all the different types of anemia. And when it does that, there isn't a CKD or renal or kidney, okay, that we're looking for. However, it does say in or due to or with. Now, that being said, that's causal relationship. And I'm going to show you in the guidelines in a little bit. I actually grabbed the guideline and put it up on a slide. With or due to is causal. There's a relationship there now, whenever you see that. So if you click or indent from in, you're going to be able to see chronic kidney disease is one of those options. Now, I didn't list everything, but end-stage renal disease, renal failure, right? Or in neoplastic disease. Now, chronic kidney disease is not the same as end-stage renal disease and renal failure. Okay, those are different codes. There's N18.5 is end-stage renal disease, and then you have N18.1 through 4 is chronic kidney disease, and then renal failure. I can't remember what the code is for that, or if that's the same as end-stage renal disease. Okay, so that being said, if we establish that the patient has chronic kidney disease and we have a causal relationship from the anemia, we're going with D63.1 because it says right there, that's the code to use. Okay, the patient has anemia due to the chronic kidney disease, right? Causal relationship. Now, the key here is that it's indented. Remember, most of the time this is taught through diabetes, because if you want to teach anybody guidelines in ICD, just use diabetes and you can teach almost every guideline out there. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And so that's usually the example that's given. But anemia really truly is a good one because there is a lot of causal relationships with anemia. And so you're looking at your codes, and I'm just going to go ahead and while we're doing that, pull up the index over here. So we go down, we find anemia. We went and we try to find renal or kidney. It's not there. But we see in, or which means due to or with, that does indent. And we know the guidelines tell us that when a causal relationship is available, then we use it. Okay, so let's look here at, I'm going to just put behind the scenes anemia. So let's look at the next slide and the guidelines that we need to be familiar with. Now, I'm going to show you a lot of them so that we can compare. Not all of them are over anemia, but we're talking about causal relationships. So let's backtrack and talk about other causal relationships that we'll see. When we're talking about the circulatory system, hypertension, right here, it tells you, it presumes a causal relationship between hypertension, heart involvement, and between hypertension and kidney involvement. So in other words, when a patient has hypertension and they have CKD, even before the rules changed and we could assume causal relationships, that was like 2016, 17 when that changed, we could always do a causal relationship between CKD and hypertension. That was back then, before 2017, that was an exception to the rule. Okay. However, hypertension and heart involvement, like CHF, that wasn't causal. So we could assume CKD, but we couldn't with hypertension, but we couldn't do heart involvement. We had to have the keywords like with that showed it. That all kind of went out the window in 2017, I believe it was, and therefore causal relationships were assumed if they were in the indent, meaning if you go look at diabetes and then you look into the indent, everything that was listed didn't have to be assumed anymore. So if a person had diabetes and CKD, there was a link and you coded it as if the link was there. Right? And this is also stating for hypertension for causal relationships, you're going to assume that causal relationship with hypertension and CKD, okay? And then it says they're linked with the term with in the alphabetic index. So in other words, if you go to the index and you can see with and there's a link, then you put them together. Okay. You don't have to have the provider tell you. You assume that. Okay. Now, those are conditions that are code, provider documentation. The only time you don't do that now is if the provider tells you not to. Okay. They're not linked. So now we're going to look at the guideline that says with. When you use the word with or in, should be interpreted as associated with, due to, and so you're going to look at it. It appears in the alphabetic index under the main term or subterm or an instructional note in the tabular. So your index is where you go and you find your code based on the diagnosis. And then the tabular is where you turn to then get more information and further guidelines and specificity in the tabular. And it has the description of the code. So the classification presumes a causal relationships between the two conditions linked by these terms in the alphabetic index or tabular. Now we already know from that previous that when we looked in the index, what did we see? We saw the with. So if we pull this over quick, anemia, look at all of those. And if that's what you're going to look at when you look at the anemia. I'm going to click on that, and this is taken strictly what your index looks like. Here's our indent. These are all the different types of anemia. There's that aplastic. So then the first thought would be, I'm going to go and look at, it's kidney or renal, right? Well, it isn't in there. So you can go look at the R's and you can go look at the K's you're not going to look at. You're not going to find it. However, and you can see here it's not in there, right? But in, due to, or with is. So let's see all of the conditions that have a causal relationship, that's what this means, with anemia. And it is chronic kidney disease, end-stage renal disease, kidney failure, and if there is a neoplastic, if there's a cancer, right? So those all, plus everything here, right? So That's amazing, right? That tells us that yes, there is a relationship there. Okay, so and we know the guideline tells us whenever you see with, that means you can assume it. So just and I don't know why, but you guys forgive me these headers. I put spaces in here and they just scrunched all up so it looks like anemia and the heart. So some other causal relationships that are assumed will be when you're dealing with things like atherosclerotic disease, angina, okay? Combination codes for these. So as well as chronic kidney disease, you're going to have hypertension and chronic kidney disease and transplant. Look for more information and guidelines under that, okay? So again, this is telling you just be aware of these causal relationships. So let's go talk about what causes anemia and CKD. I have the article over here. I'm going to show it to you before we get done. But these are the things that I thought you needed to know to make your mind feel at ease as to why there is a relationship there. Okay. And usually that causal relationship means to people is that, you know, it's very common or often that if you have CKD, you're going to suffer anemia, right? So there's a relationship. Just like if you have CKD, you probably have hypertension. If you have chronic hypertension, you're going to have problems with your kidneys. Right? We know that because of the statistics we've collected as coders. And that's another reason why we want to always code to the highest specificity, make sure we get the right codes. So this just goes in to say that whenever you have any damage or disease in the kidneys, they can't get enough of this EPO, and the bone marrow will produce less red blood cells, thus anemia. Right? So the anemia is very something that we need to take care of, because if we don't have the red blood cells, we can't get the oxygen to the organs, and most of all, important to the brain, right? That controls the whole body. There are other causes for anemia when people have kidney disease, and that might be because of the hemodialysis. So again, we talked about that a little bit ago, and you want to make sure that it's going to notate. If a person has CKD, always, always, always check, are they on dialysis or not? Now, if they are a CKD 5er, they're on dialysis, right? Because that's end-stage renal disease. And if you're end-stage renal disease, you don't have a choice. You're on dialysis. And there's additional codes we need to identify that. So how do we take care of that? They give you iron, then give you vitamin B12, and then give you folic acid. Right? So that'll bring up those levels for you. Now, CKD and anemia, that relationship, there are nutrients in the red blood cells that make the hemoglobin, and that carries the oxygen in the red blood cells. Again, this is kind of biology that you got in school. So anytime that you're doing any type of treatment to the kidneys and it's related anemia does not help, the healthcare provider will do other testing. So they'll look for problems with the bone marrow. You know, is this a type of leukemia? Maybe we have inflammatory problems. Do we have an autoimmune disorder? Does the patient have rheumatoid arthritis or lupus? Do they have IBS? You know, then do they have any chronic infections or like a diabetic ulcer, maybe on their toe, and malnutrition? All of those could be contributing factors that aren't CKD. So if the patient has any of this going on, then that relationship, you may doubt that relationship between the CKD. So they have CKD, they have anemia, and if they have one of these other things going on, query the provider, right? So what are the signs and symptoms? It's really important for us as coders to understand the disease process and the signs and the symptoms. We boil it down to the basic. Why do we need to know? Well, for one thing, in the outpatient world, we code the signs and symptoms if we don't have a higher specificity or a final diagnosis, right? Whereas in the inpatient, we're going to have all these signs and symptoms, and we will probably be coding them even when we get the diagnosis because they're telling the story. We're trying to fix that, right? So it's important that you know the signs and symptoms of people that have anemia and CKD together. Some of these you may already be aware of, but weakness, fatigue, headaches, problems with concentration, paleness, dizziness, shortness of breath, problems with breathing, and chest pain. So what's chest pain? Angina. What does that other person have? Or at the beginning, they had angina. So that's telling, right? So we have a person that comes in with chest pain and anemia, all right? And then on top of that, they state that they have CKD. So already we're showing a loop. We can think, okay, that provider is saying one of the signs and symptoms of a patient that has CKD and anemia is chest pain. So is the chest pain due to the anemia and the CKD? Now there's not a code for that. So don't worry about saying, oh no, now I got to find a new angina code that relates all this. No, there isn't one. So if there isn't a causal relationship code, uh, don't worry, don't overthink it, all right? If there is, you'll be able to find it in the index, and then you'll be able to move forward. So don't overthink it and think you've got to find causal relationships for all of this stuff. But the provider's thinking, okay, now, do we have a heart condition happening here? You know, do we have a blockage? Do we have atherosclerotic heart disease, causing chest pain? Or is it just the fact that the patient's anemic
Hi,
and
Shauna.
they have CKD? Maybe that's causing the chest pain. Now they uh, said angina, and angina is completely related to uh, is cardiovascular, usually. So let's look at this particular article that I felt was so good, and it is the NIDDK. Let's move up here to the top so you can get more information from this. And it's National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Diseases, right? So that's all they do. And anemia and chronic kidney disease. So in other words, that right there, the fact that you have this being put out by Health and Human Services and this institute tells you it is so common that problems with anemia and chronic kidney disease that it's got articles that the NIDDK has talked about it. Right. So that gives you a pretty good, what I want to say. That gives you confidence in that causal relationship, right? So this goes on to tell you what is anemia, how is it related, and I pulled that, okay, for the slide deck. Then there's other things that I thought was beneficial, but I didn't pull that. Okay, because I knew I was going to give you that link, and I want you to take the time to go in and do additional research, because we're really not per se talking about just chronic kidney disease and anemia. The main focus is, hey, causal relationships, right? When we code for causal relationships, this just happened to be an excellent example that shows you the disease process and how there is a causal relationship there. Also, when we know that the provider's trying to link this, then we want to know what type of blood test, what is the provider looking for? What are the provider's questions to the patient, for the signs and the symptoms? Because if we understand the disease process, then we know where the provider's going with this. And therefore we can code faster and at a higher specificity because we don't miss something. We realize, oh yeah, there is a relationship between anemia and CKD. Oh, there's a relationship between chest pain and patients who have anemia and CKD. Okay. So there's additional information of how they treat this. We did see that they got a transfusion, right? And that also tells us folic acid, vitamin B12, a lot of times they give you shots, and nutrition and eating. And there is the different foods that will give you additional iron and B12. Look, did you guys know that spinach was huge. I remember it's really good with folic acid, but it is also really good with iron. You had to be careful because it has calcium in it too. I had to be careful with that. Beef liver is excellent. Lots of good stuff in beef liver if you like that. And then some other references and bouncing, I call them areas where you can bounce off and get additional information on things that are going out, happening behind the scenes, that we might see things occurring when we are doing these type of studies, and maybe a new test that's being done by the providers. So I like to look at those too. Now, if you're a new coder, again, you're following us from that perspective, you know, again, the biggest thing about clinicians and people who have a little bit of a medical background is they overthink everything, right? Because they know all of this stuff. So they might assume causal relationships when there aren't one, because they know the disease process. However, we're tied, our hands are tied via the fact that we are not clinicians. Coders are not clinicians. Now, can you be a clinician and be a coder? Absolutely, and that makes it's a great job for clinicians. However, that does not follow. That is not our scope of practice. Okay, and so we have to separate yourself unless you were hired to do something other than the coding as a clinician. We still can research, we still can understand the disease process and increase our knowledge base, because also you have to remember, we are that liaison for the provider. We are helping to interpret and communicate for statistics so that we can, help with research, etc., as well as our providers want to get paid. And if we don't have the proper codes in place, they're not going to get paid properly. We want them to get paid for the work that they're doing. So we are working together as a team, and that means our knowledge base needs to be always increasing. Now, if you fall into this scenario, and again, we didn't have all the information of the encounter, just that one section. What do? And we can't make a decision. You query the provider and you state, you know, in my research, I saw that there's a causal relationship between anemia and CKD. That is this CKD, anemia unspecified, and give them the code in the description, or is this anemia with CKD and the causal relationship there, and then put that code there. They get to pick, and then tell them, what makes it one or the other, so that when I look at the notes, or this happens again, or this patient comes in again, I can make sure I'm coding to the highest specificity. Okay, there's nothing wrong with asking, but in this scenario, I would say yes, there is a causal relationship because of what the index tells us, and our guidelines tell us that whenever there is a with, or an in, or due to, then the causal relationship is given, and we can use that code. So that's the code I would use, the anemia and CKD. And we have the fact that the signs and symptoms of chest pain and other things to corroborate why we would think that. And a lot of people don't realize that code even exists. So that's something that you can educate your fellow coders, maybe in the office, say, hey, guess what I learned on the CCO Club videos. If you have any questions, make sure you let us know. We have a lot of fun doing these webinars. If you want to be a part of the CCO Club, just go to cco.us/club. Again, this question came in to the club, and I thought it was a brilliant question, a great way to reiterate that causal relationship that you will be tested on if you're a new coder. It'll be on all of your exams, whether you're going to be doing inpatient, outpatient, ambulatory surgery, maybe you're going to do hematology and oncology, or maybe you're going to get a renal certification. There's all kinds that would be applicable. It'd be pertinent to cardiology as well, right? Because angina would fall into that. So you could see these coming up in all sorts of credentialing exam specialties as well as your basic ones. So make sure that you understand the causal relationship and how to identify it. In the real world, if you have questions like that, feel free to do what this person did and put it in the club, and you can, get several opinions. Mine, you can get the other instructors, you can get our subject matter experts, as well as other coders out there and students. This benefits everybody when you ask. It allows us to discuss it or show scenarios or things that we've learned, or maybe something that your provider has educated you in, and then you could share that with us, and it just makes us look smarter when we go to speak to our provider or make a query, right? Uh, if you're following us on Facebook and YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe. You can ask questions there, but we don't get into those venues as much as we do the CCO Club. Though that's our primary, that's our focus, is the CCO Club. We do appreciate your comments. Share those with your friends. If this particular webinar was helpful to you, send it to one of your friends if you think it'd be helpful to them. And the new platform that is live streaming now is LinkedIn. So if you are visiting us via LinkedIn, don't forget, you can share us in LinkedIn, and we appreciate that. Most of the advertising, all the advertising we do is via word of mouth. Don't forget, you can come to ask questions at the CCO Club, and we appreciate you using CCO for your educational needs. All right, guys. See you next time.